My name's Tim Shiel. I'm from Melbourne, which is a city to the south of Sydney. And I've been making music for about 8 years, making and releasing music on my own under the name Faux Pas, which some of you might have heard of, most of you probably have not. And I've been doing that. I've released a couple EPs, a few albums over those 8 years, doing it all myself with, a little bit of help, but essentially self-managed and self-whatever. Doing it the DIY way. And along the way, I've been doing other stuff as well. I'm a radio broadcaster down in Melbourne for Triple R, 3 Triple R FM. I've been doing that for about 6 years. And but most recently, I've spent the last couple of years touring with Gotye, who is a very successful Australian art pop artist. How's that? Art pop? Close enough. Yeah, and that came about because I've known Wally for a very long time. We went to university together, and sort of him as Gotye and me as Faux Pas, we'd often be trading musical ideas as well as sort of vibing off each other in terms of trying to navigate doing things DIY. And I just sort of watched his career just go from sort of strength to strength over the years, and was so proud of him. And a couple of years ago was in a situation where he was trying to get a band together to perform Making Mirrors, which was an album he was about to release. And he approached me because I'm a bit of an Ableton nerd. He is as well. He's a super Ableton nerd. A lot of that album was written on Ableton, as his previous albums had been as well. And so together we developed the Gotye live show, which started out as just 3 dudes playing a couple of theatre shows around Sydney and Melbourne. But because of the kind of runaway success of somebody that I used to know, turned into a massive worldwide touring extravaganza with like 30 people and 3 trucks and all that stuff. So I wanted to introduce the band, I guess. If you guys can sort of see this, this is a photo taken at Radio City Music Hall, the iconic venue in New York, which seats like 6,000 people or something. And here you can see the 5 kind of core members of the band, or you can sort of see us because we're dwarfed by the insane projection. But on the left here, you've got me about to hit something with a stick. Up on the riser, Wally, obviously. Michael on the drums. Lucas there on bass guitar. And Ben, our guitarist, who there is playing a lap steel guitar. And our stage setup at this point, this is sort of really in the middle of when the touring was pretty intense, and this was sort of the core setup for our stage for probably about 12 months. With lots of different stations, which involved a lot of live instruments, lots of live drums, multiple sort of drum kits set up that Wally could move around the stage to play in different positions depending on what was appropriate. Michael's drum rig was pretty large. Lucas and Ben between them had 10 to 15 guitars that they would swap out for whatever was appropriate for whatever song we were performing. But at most of the stations, there's also MIDI controllers, and that's where the use of Ableton, I guess, comes in, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I thought actually the best way to introduce what we were doing with Ableton with the Gotye show was to actually play the video that Adam mentioned. When we were in Berlin, the guys from Ableton HQ came down and actually interviewed us and recorded some footage from the show, which was a bit of a smaller club show than some of the bigger stages we ended up playing. But yeah, I'll just play it because it's a really good, it's a good introduction to how the show works. I'm not really sure sort of where we're at in the crowd in terms of Ableton knowledge. Could I get a show of hands, like who currently uses Ableton? Or like, okay, everyone. Like, who would be like an expert user, consider themselves an expert user, a heavy user, or yeah, really? Okay, well, fancy yourself a bit then, sure. Yeah, okay, cool. That's just good for me to know because I sort of don't want to dumb down things too much, but I don't want to fly over people's heads once we get into the nuts and bolts. But I'll just start with this this video, which for me is a little bit embarrassing for a couple of reasons that'll probably be obvious to you, but I'll explain them later if you don't pick up the embarrassing parts. All right. Woo, yay, Gotye, wow, cool. Yeah, so I think you guys all got it. The embarrassing part was the dad dancing, which I did on a nightly basis. I can get away with it now because since we've been back from tour, I became a dad, so now it's cool, but at the time, no. It's just one of those moments where you look back at something and just regret it. You really regret it. And unfortunately, because of the profile of Gotye and where things got to, like, most of our performances and most of the dad dancing that I did over a period of 2 years is on YouTube. So if you thought that was hilarious and just want to go home and keep laughing at me, you can, because it's all up there. And also, yeah, that sax solo, that was probably one of the lamest ones that I did in 150 shows. So I kind of like in that product demo, they're like, yeah, this does this really cool thing at the climax of the show. And I'm just there going, duh, 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 but eventually it got better. It was improvised every night, that part of the show. But if we have time, and I'm sure we do, I'll sort of show you how that solo worked. It was really basic. I sort of already explained it in the video. But yeah, I also wanted to sort of play that video because I feel like it's important. How many people, if anyone, saw the Gotye show for Making Mirrors in 2011? Or yeah, all right, 1. So 2, great. So you guys are all too cool to come and see Gotye, obviously, that's totally fine. You know, would I go? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I wanted to show that video because I feel like it's important. I'm about to drill down into really computer-based stuff, Ableton, blah, blah, blah. But that video, I think, does demonstrate that we're a live band. We used a lot of live instruments. And the key to how we set the show up, or the guiding principle for a lot of it, was maintaining that live energy. Even though Wally and I were predominantly playing MIDI instruments, predominantly triggering clips through pads and keyboards and stuff, we really tried to set the show up so it felt like it had that live energy, not just in moments, but for the whole entire set. Even though we used elements of playback, we had click track and obviously lots of samplers and, you know, weird sounds coming out of places and you not knowing where they're coming from. We always tried to keep in mind that we wanted it to feel live. So I think that video is good for you to watch. So as I drill into things, you don't get the impression that it was just some weird karaoke session with Wally singing over the top of it, because it really wasn't that. It was our goal was the opposite of that. So all right, let me get into the basics of how the rig worked. We had 2 Ableton computers that ran the show. One sat with the drummer. The name of that computer was Demis. We named him after Demis Roussos, who's a famous Greek folk singer and pop culture icon. And Demis's responsibility was playback. So for each song, the drummer would trigger the start of the song, we'd all get a count in, and then we'd be playing the song to a click track, which was coming from that Ableton project. That Ableton project was also running some elements on a backing track. And it also was, at various points throughout the tour, it sort of mutated as we went, but it would also send signals to lighting, to our lighting guy, so that some of his lighting changes could be very tightly synchronized to the arrangement. And the second computer was with me at the front, and that computer was called McRory. And I'll show you McRory, because this is McRory here. This is the computer from tour. It's been to this has been to a lot of countries. This computer is quite weird. How do I just hide everything? Yep, there we go. Here's McRory. All right. This is something else to jot down and look up on YouTube. This dude is amazing. He's like a sort of weird, trippy, washed-out LA dude who his whole thing is MIDI. He loves MIDI. He loves MIDI controllers. So you can see he's sort of got his sort of customized keyboard thing. Like he has 2 of them that he'll play sort of guitar style. He's got drum pads that he thumps on his chest at various points during songs. And you can't see here, but beneath his sort of cut-off tight shorts, his feet are connected to like drum triggers, so he'll trigger kick and snare and stuff with his. And then on his heels, he's got hi-hats and cowbells and stuff. And yeah, we all just fell in love with McRory because he's got like a 6-minute YouTube clip where he just does covers. It's just this incredible medley of Destiny's Child, Foreigner, like any vaguely popular song of all time. He does it all live singing. And anyway, so it seemed appropriate that we would name this computer McRory because that's what the computer did as well. We essentially became McRory when we engaged with the computer. McRory's role was that it was connected to all the MIDI controllers on stage. McRory essentially acted as a giant sampler. So all of the sounds that we wanted to be able to play were all in that Ableton project, and they were all connected to the various keyboards, launch pads, drum pads, and other type controllers that we had on stage, which I'll get into that as well at some point. So those are the 2 computers. And they both had separate, obviously, Ableton projects. So I'm just going to drill into the projects, I guess. Demis's project, the playback project, and the McCrory's sample triggering project. And I thought I'll make sure there's a couple of moments where you guys can ask questions because, like I said, I sort of feel like if you don't know anything about Ableton, if you're new, and which is great, like you're in the right place to learn if you've come to this event today, some of this stuff might seem really like it's just not going to make sense, or I might not explain it well or articulate it properly. So I want to give you the chance to ask questions. And on the flip side, if you're an Ableton expert, I think you might actually be surprised at the simplicity of some of the concepts. You know, we really weren't pushing the envelope with this show. We were just sort of using Ableton to do nuts and bolts and just make the show happen. Actually, before I get into it, I'll just mention a lot of, like before we started touring at the start of 2011, Wally and I spent a lot of time in production rehearsals listening to his album and trying to figure out how to perform it live. If you've heard any of his songs, or particularly one of his albums, you'll know that each song has a vastly different sonic palette. And that's largely to do with the fact that he works with so many samples. So he'll use a sample that has like a Spanish guitar and some lightly feathered jazz drums, and then he'll combine that with some weird analog synth from the 70s, and then the next track will be like Depeche Mode 80s synths with like Phil Collins gated drums. And so that's sort of his whole shtick, is each song is a whole complete sonic world. And it's part of what makes his music so interesting and so appealing. So that was the other guiding principle, I guess, of us trying to get this show together. One was to keep it live, make it really feel live. But the second was to try and achieve that fidelity of sound and be true to the songs, be true to his arrangements. Because unlike some bands, I suppose, who maybe spend a long time writing songs and then they go in the studio and they craft the sounds, if they've got a more sort of conventional band approach and maybe use more conventional instruments, then the process for them in terms of converting that show to a live show might be as simple as figuring out what the right guitars are to use, or making sure that in your synth station you've got, 3 or 4 synths that are going to be able to cover the handful of keyboard sounds that you're going to use in your show from start to finish. For us, that wasn't an option, because the only way we could really recreate all of those sounds would be to travel with 20 different musicians who were talented in all different styles of music and with so many different instruments and blah, blah, blah. So the production rehearsal process to begin with for Wally and I was trying to figure out what could be covered by the musicians we did have, guitarists, bass player, drums, and then what, on top of that, what could Wally and I do? What were the most interesting parts of each song that we could perform that were going to feel live and actually allow a bit of room for us to improvise and, be interesting to the audience. And then anything else that we couldn't cover, we had to make the decision about just not covering it and just trying to have the song just be a bit empty. Maybe there's a layer missing, or putting it in the playback project, which is Demis, which is essentially, the track that we played along to. Does that all make sense? I didn't take a breath, so I do that. All right, so this sits with the drummer, this computer, and this launch pad. Each of these lights, so we're in the Launchpad's user 1 mode. Each of these lights corresponds to a different point in the arrangement view here of Ableton. And if I just zoom out, you can see that essentially our whole set is here horizontally. Each song is represented with these little, locator points. And these locator points are mapped to buttons on the Launchpad. So, for example, if Michael wanted to start things off for The Only Way, which is the first one here, he would press this button, I think. His Launchpad had we printed out little stickers so he could remember which button was which song, but I don't have the stickers, so I'm just going to have to guess. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see that started The Only Way. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's me saying 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I just go through, it's a pretty basic set. I'll go through what is here, starting at the bottom. These 2 tracks are the backing track for this song. So in this case, The Only Way. We're covering all, synth parts and guitar and yada yada, but we didn't have enough hands to cover this clap and sort of tambourine part. And in the rehearsal process, we realised that the song wasn't going to work if we didn't have those parts. So that's coming from that backing track line. And then next to that, you've got backing vocals. So all these sounds, the backing track and the backing vocals, and all of the sounds used in the other project, which I will show you, they're all from the stems of Wally's record. So they've all come essentially out of the studio with all of the hours spent on tweaking the production. Wally spent a long time with the producer Frank Titaz, who you guys may be familiar with. He's worked with Kimber in architecture in Helsinki and Bertie Blackman and a whole bunch of others. If you watch the Grammys telecast, he's the other guy that was up on stage. He worked heavily with Wally on this record and has for the last few records. And together, they sort of took Wally's ideas, which were based around samples and recorded instruments and like a real homemade vibe. That's always been his vibe. Particularly with this record, they took that. They actually took it from Ableton into Pro Tools, or just sort of Frank's environment. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Pro Tools. And just tweaked everything within an inch of its life to have that total high fidelity sound. And so we wanted to have that sound in the show. We didn't want to be, we didn't want to go halfway. So it was actually quite an easy thing for us to just grab all of the stems. We just had Frank bounce all of the stems out from the record. Many of them had already been bounced out because, for remixes and stuff. And we used that as the source material when cutting up, when making these tracks. And having that like on a hard drive and touring around with it meant that we could tweak things as we go. If we decided that there was for example, that tambourine part, if it wasn't in there and we decided we wanted it, we had it because it was in the stem. So we were sort of always referring back to those arrangements and just trying to capture the feeling of them, at least to begin with. As we went, we would start to improvise and things would stretch, and we'd kind of, as we learnt each other's strengths and weaknesses as band members, we could figure out whether people could kind of cover parts by doing other interesting things. Maybe there's a synth line on the album that's really important, but over time the guitarist maybe has an idea where he can approximate a slightly similar melody but with a particular guitar sound that's got a different character but performs the same purpose. Then it would just be really easy to just go in and take that synth line out of the backing track, to just pull up the, for each track I had a different Ableton project that had all of the stems in it, so I could just go into that project, take out that synth line because I know Ben's going to cover it, bounce out a new stem and pop it into here. So that's that. The click track is the click track, obviously, and started with 1, 2, 3, 4, basically, so we knew where we were, we knew where we were coming in. Up here is potentially interesting to some of you. We ran all of the visuals for this show from Ableton. Ableton's not known as video software, and its implementation of video is really, really basic. Basically, if you drop a video clip onto a track in Ableton, this miraculous video window, which you otherwise never see, just magically appears on your screen and it plays the video. It will also play the audio from the video as well, and it accepts a wide variety of formats. And I guess Ableton don't really mention it much because it's just not, like, what are you going to do with it? You can't kind of run video effects or, I don't know, like if you're a video guy, you're not going to go to Ableton to edit your videos, I suppose. But aside from the live aspect, which we ended up using it for, it's actually really useful for scoring as well. If you're scoring a short film or, an ad or TV or something, it's actually really useful to drop in a movie and be able to write music to the movie and have it always be synced and lining up time-wise and stuff. That's pretty useful. And you can export video from Ableton too. Excuse me. So, yeah. But yeah, I was actually saying before, like, so we would just load up this project. We'd have we'd have a projector, often on a much bigger screen than this, and we just set that up as the second monitor of the machine, drag that video window onto that second monitor, double-click it, pops into full screen, and like that's our projector setup. And it's funny, we met, especially at the bigger venues that we played, we met a lot of like video dudes and projector dudes that were just like, we can't believe that you run the show like this, like why don't you have this $50,000 video server system? And, it's like the same sort of things that people would use at sporting events to show things on the big screen and stuff, We'd just bypass all of that and plug Ableton in and drag that across and Bob's your uncle. And yeah, so it worked. That's sort of the theme of the whole thing, is we just did what worked. So just a couple more things about this project, then I'll move on, because I'm just crapping on. I mentioned we occasionally use this project, depending on the lighting designer we were with, to send sync up with his lighting rig. That would happen through a thing called Sympty, which is a kind of time code. I'll give you a really brief listen to what that sounds like. Great. So that's just like a constantly mutating series of frequencies that is decoded on the other end, and so the lighting desk understands like exactly at what point of the song we're at that time, and so lights flashing and stuff could be triggered, within milliseconds of musical events happening. So we did that on and off. At the moment, just for like the ease of this presentation, everything's coming down the one line, but we obviously sent all of these things down different stereo channels. So we were using an RME Fireface 800, which is a very common sound card, especially in the live environment. And we would run 8 outputs from that from this computer. So, one stereo pair would be the backing track, one stereo pair would be the backing vocals. The click track would come down one. It wouldn't go to the front of house. It would just go to the monitors guy who was side of stage with his own mixing desk. And he would work the click track into the mixes that he was making for us in our in-ears. And then, actually, I guess that would be it. I guess it was just 5. Oh, maybe the time code as a sixth channel. Cool. So before I move on to the other Ableton project, does anyone have any questions about how this worked? Or, maybe over here. I don't know if we've got a mic. Oh, I'm holding the wireless mic, aren't I? How's this one? Is this one on? Great. I might get you, Adam, to do the honours.
All right, questions so far? Yo, Matt.
So did Ableton ever crash?
Yeah,
what did you do about it?
That's the main question I get asked. Ableton never crashed, no. We had some issues like over time that we were able to resolve. The main issue when we first started out was that we would often have hard disk errors, when the hard disk indicator light flashes, because and we assumed that was to do with us accessing too many samples at once, like trying to access lots of different parts of the hard drive all at once. We weren't scientists, like we were all computer geeks. We were just trying to figure it out on our own. So, we would just be looking up forums like anybody would and trying to suss out what we could do to fix things. And over time, we ended up sort of rebuilding our computers, making sure they had solid-state drives, making sure they were pretty much the top of the range in terms of processor power, and also doing things like making sure that the drives were foamed correctly so that they were resistant to vibration, and securing firewire cables so that they couldn't be pulled out. I mean, I do get asked that question a lot, and that was probably the only Ableton-specific problem we had. But we did have crashes on stage, but it was all human error. It was very rarely, if not never, something to do with the software. It was always like the guitar tech, God bless him, Pat, great guy, but he goes on this cramped stage in Delhi in India, goes to give Ben his guitar, and in doing so steps on this hard drive, which is where all of the sound is coming from, all the files are coming from. Computer shits itself. The guys have to sort of do some vamp while we spend a couple of minutes plugging everything back in. But like that happened, but that's the same as like someone accidentally putting their foot through a guitar amp or something. Like it's not the guitar amp's fault, it's the person's fault. So yeah, we had those kind of problems, I guess. But maybe does anyone have like questions specific to how this project worked, I guess, and maybe we might save other questions till the end, if that's cool.
Yeah, we've got one over here. One sec.
Your launchpad like the drummer had, and they were all lit up, and you said he had stickers on it and whatnot.
Yeah.
And was that particularly just for the start of each track, and you guys would run a whole track, or would you guys jam out? Like I can see there's different launches as the song goes on. Would you extend sections? Or was there any of that sort of stuff going on, or was it basically start and then go?
It was basically start and go. For some songs, we would start live, and so the drummer would sort of play just enough of a track for us to get a feel of the tempo, and then we'd improvise, and then he would just manually trigger a song and it would start. And vice versa, we'd often have songs just sort of end, but we'd just keep going. But we didn't really experiment much with tweaking the arrangement in terms of looping sections for different lengths. And a lot of that actually would have been interesting to do, but really it goes back to that idea of we were really trying to be faithful to these songs, and Wally and Frank had spent so much time writing them so that they had a story, and elicited a certain emotional response, and it's an extremely finely crafted pop record, that Gotye album. And so once you go in there and start saying, hey, you know what, we'll just do a 32-bar, jazz jam in this section because what the hell, we'll just have fun. His music just wasn't suited for it. For other music, it would have been cool to jam out, but we did try it, and it just sort of never felt right. It felt much more right just to play the songs. So it wasn't so much a technical limitation, just we decided not to. But there's a couple other things on here just for like looping like sections of an intro, or getting the right tempo. Or there was like a test project. Oh, my video windows disappeared. There was a like a test pattern thing that we'd pull up in where is that? We'd pull that up in soundcheck so our lighting guy could get everything in position, and we had a soundcheck thing like project that just looped a section over and over and over so that our sound guy could get a good balance between the computer elements and the live elements. That's enough about that because I'm rapidly running out of time. This happened last time I did this as well. I just talked too much. I'll pull up the other project and I'll just give you a brief overview, and then if there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. A funny story about this project, which is the sample triggering project. It takes about a minute to load, or 50 seconds. That's pretty real, I got to say. And so that question about did Ableton ever crash? Like, we never wanted it to, because if it did, that's a minute can be like an eternity in the middle of a live show, especially if it's sort of pretty finely crafted, like ours was. A minute is just that's a lot of dead air. So yeah, thanks Ableton for not crashing. Your famed stability was actually borne out on our 150 however shows we did. It's great. Yeah, while the thing's spinning. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, just shout it.
So, which one's looking after the tempo? Because obviously tempo's changing from song to song.
Great question. So the question is, which of the machines was looking after tempo? Demis, the playback machine, was running tempo. But in some ways, it was irrelevant because nothing that we were doing in this project in terms of triggering samples was synced to tempo. So we were playing everything live. We weren't triggering loops. The only tempo-based things happening with these sounds were delays, I guess, that might be set to the tempo of the track. But a lot of those delays were applied by our front-of-house mix engineer, not actually within Ableton. So it's his responsibility to tap a tempo in or have a preset for a particular song.
So did Demis ever have to deal with other guy?
No, they didn't. No, Demis and McLay never talked. They just, did their own thing. They weren't mates. Well, they might have been mates, but just the kind of mates that just sit and have a beer and don't really talk about anything. But so there was no sync between the computers or anything. All right, McLay. So starting at the left of the project. So this is the whole set. The whole set here is this, we didn't change. We didn't load different Ableton projects. Over here is basically a bunch of MIDI input channels that don't generate sound. And they're just, for each one of these, this represents a different MIDI controller that was on stage. So the mallet cat is Wally's, I don't know, has anyone here seen a mallet cat? It's a pretty weird instrument. It's basically a MIDI controller that emulates, I guess, a xylophone, but in place of the xylophone thingies, it's whatever you call them, it's rubber pads. So you play it with mallets and you can get really interesting percussive performances out of it. So Wally used that as his sort of primary controller. Just moving along, I had an SBD, which is like a drum pad with 9 pads on it. Wally also had one. I had a launch pad. Wally had 3 launch pads. This is a launch pad in case you're new to this whole world. Wally had 3 launch pads that were set up so that they all triggered the same sounds. And so he would have a launch pad in his 3 different main vocal positions so that he could move from here to over there for whatever reason in a song and still be accessing the same sounds. And that was just done through pretty simple MIDI routing in this part of the project. I had a Nord keyboard, a Nord Stage 2, which we used to get keyboard sounds and synth sounds, but predominantly I was using it as a MIDI controller. Initially, and you would have seen in the video, I was using this, which is a great little keyboard, the Akai MPK Mini, which many of you are probably familiar with, but upgraded to the Nord because I just ran out of keys. I needed more keys, and I started to actually learn how to play proper piano and stuff. So, which, this gets a bit frustrating if you actually want to play proper piano and stuff. So. And then just down here, you've got like feedback tracks, which some of you might have seen before, which basically take the MIDI that the Launchpad is sending to Ableton and sends the MIDI just straight back to the Launchpad, and that's how you get your lights happening in user 1 mode. If you see, as I hit it, the pad lights up. That's not Launchpad's default behavior, even though some would say that it should be. You have to set up these feedback loops in order to get that to happen. And so just, going into any track, thanks for your time, it's the same thing. It's just each of these tracks represents a different instrument that's on stage. And for me to get through from track to track, I would just go into Launchpad's mixer mode. You saw me do it in the video. Launchpad's mixer mode is like a visual representation of Ableton's, what you can see on the screen. You see that red square? It's sort of lining up with what's happening in the mixer mode here. So I would just, turn off the state-of-the-art groups and move over to thanks for your time. And now all of those tracks are audible. So I wasn't actually changing whether tracks were armed or not. All tracks were actually armed at all times, which meant that if I was hitting this button on the Launchpad, you can see that it's actually triggering audio in all of those groups. But the only one you can hear is the one that's not muted. That also had some consternation from some people. It was like, I can't believe you're doing that, and Ableton still survives. But it's a robust machine, Ableton. So that's pretty much it. I'm not sure what else I can show you in this project, but I'm happy to maybe take some questions. That's probably the right thing to do, and then wrap up. I don't know how am I doing for time.
Yeah, you're doing great for time. All good.
All right, cool. Well, yeah. Does anyone have any questions about this project or about anything to do with tour? Or
We've got one right here.
Yeah.
I saw that you were running an audio click rather than the internal Ableton click. Can you talk us through that and reasons why and all that?
Yeah, that was pretty straightforward. That was because our drummer, Michael, has played with a bunch of bands before and has been in this situation as well before, playing to click with a band. And he was just very particular about the sound that he wanted in his ears. He wanted, he gave me the file. He was like, "This is my woodblock." The first day he came to rehearsal, he was like, "This is the only woodblock I want to hear," which was great. So yeah, I think so. It wasn't. I'm just trying to remember the project. It wasn't audio click, wasn't it? So he must have been bouncing down the audio rather than just pulling that sample into a drum rack and triggering it. Why is that? Don't know. Probably would have been smarter just to put it in a drum rack and just program the MIDI clips to play every beat. But yeah, that's the short answer to that question, essentially.
And just one other one. You weren't running a redundant rig at all?
Great question. No. So a redundant rig, for anyone who's curious, is having multiple setups. So what I described for either of the two computer setups we had on stage, a redundant rig, you would have a second whole setup, like a second computer, second sound card, second thing of everything. And it would be all set up so that in most cases, both are active, both are receiving MIDI, and both are sending out audio. And so that at any time, if one crashed, it would just automatically, in most situations, automatically switch to the second computer which hasn't crashed. Or in some situations, maybe it would just be a really easy flick of a switch for someone backstage, like a monitors engineer or one of the techs, to just kind of go, shit, something's happened, flick over to the B computer. I saw, when we played Auckland Laneway, I saw M83s set up. There'd be a lot of M83 fans here. Now, they use heaps of MIDI controllers, have a very similar style of setup to this, but they used a redundant system. They had this marvellous French man called Hugo, I think his name was, whose role was just to sit side of stage with this amazing rack of like 5 MacBook Pros, and a lot of them were just sort of backing up each other, and he was just there ready to press the button, essentially, if something went wrong. Why did we not do that? That is the question I got asked by Chad Miller, who was our American keyboard tech who joined the tour as things expanded and got pretty crazy. His previous gigs before us were will.i.am, Beyonce and Bruno Mars, and he as like building the Ableton rigs for them, and he just, it took a while to convince him that we didn't need a redundant rig, and in hindsight, like, why didn't we have a redundant rig? I think Wally and I had a lot of chats about it. I mean, it would have been an investment of money, I guess, to buy all of that extra gear. Essentially, like, it's not the cheapest thing in the world to have a decent sound card and a top-of-the-line, high-spec MacBook Pro, so that was a factor. But I think we just came around to the idea that if it's going to go wrong, it goes wrong. And sometimes it happened. And like I said, it was always human error. And we just owned it. And when it did happen, sometimes they were the funnest and, for the crowd, most enjoyable parts of the show. So I don't know. There's maybe a bit of wisdom in just leaving a bit of risk in what you're doing. So, yeah. Any other questions?
One final one. Sorry. I noticed, you're running it in arrange, not in session view. And was that...
For the playback?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that just made more sense to me when I was setting it up because I could visualise the tracks, I could see the waveforms. In session view, you can't see the waveforms. And so also setting up those locators inside... we've got a stem that's the whole of the song. I'm going to pull that in and just set where my locators are for a different point. So in rehearsal, if we want to start at the second chorus, it's right there. Michael can just lean over and start the second chorus. To set something like that up in session view, we would have had to chop all of those, stems up, or at least just multiply all of those scenes and then set the different entry points for the different clips in each scene. So it just didn't make sense. So the arrangement view served us really well. Yeah, but it's not something you see a lot of live, I guess, the arrangement view being used in a live context, but easily was the right choice for us.
Yeah, I think when you were talking before about being faithful to the arrangement of the song and not needing to change the arrangement. So
that's right.
Arrangement view makes sense.
Yep.
Another question.
And then outputs on this session, how many outputs? Like, how did you run out, like, if for different instruments, if you had 20,000 things going?
Yeah, we thought about that. I mean, we did, when we started, we broke everything down. We were like, okay, we'll send percussion elements down one line. We'll send anything that's got a heavy bass component down another line, synths down another line or another stereo pair. But what we ended up doing was just overwhelming our sound guy because we already had so much other audio being generated on stage that for him to think about all of that and then think about, the 6 or 7 discrete stereo channels we were sending him from our project of different, groups of samples, he struggled to keep up with everything essentially. And then on top of that, every song has a different dynamic and a different story that's trying to tell and different swells. There was the sound engineer for our band really had to have a very musical sensibility where he was almost playing an instrument himself. That became part of the sort of character of the band was the sound engineer's input. So, yeah, we ended up moving to just having 2 stereo pairs. So everything that Wally did went down one stereo pair and everything I did went down another stereo pair. And we'd use production rehearsals and sound checks to make sure we had that mix right, the balance between, so if Wally's triggering a trumpet patch but also playing a tambourine percussion element, and this is all happening in that one song, we'd spend a lot of time in production rehearsals making sure they were balanced to each other, like, perfectly, essentially, in a sort of, live, like a venue environment. Like we did production rehearsals at the Corner Hotel in Melbourne, like a series of them where we just spend days tweaking just the fine details between the balances of these tracks so that when we got into the live situation, everything from the computer was all in the right place. So the sound engineer was never in a situation where he needed to get into the nuts and bolts of what we were doing. And also it meant that he could just look at what we were doing and look at me doing something and feel like there wasn't enough of it in the mix, and he's got a fader that's just got my parts on it. He doesn't have to think about, what's he playing? It sounds like a clav type sound. Where are the clavs on this particular, which is just crazy.
I've got a question actually. So,
yeah.
You've talked a lot about the technical setup, and it's actually quite not just surprising but also amazing that you're running everything out of, essentially a laptop, even the video, for all that sort of, all those players and all that complexity, and the redundancy, which is pretty incredible. But from the actual, the earlier part of the process, so when you looked at the album and started to deconstruct it, what was the approach there? Where did you start, and what things did you leave out? And what things did you sort of centre things around?
I guess we really ended up not leaving out a lot, because we had the ability with the backing tracks to be able to, fill the gaps. So we really were able to replicate the full arrangements of most of Wally's songs. But in terms of that process of Wally and I sitting down, like in those first rehearsals and trying to figure out how it was all going to work, it was about figuring out, what instruments, what can people... Okay, we had a lot of chats about it. It's hard to kind of come up with a short answer, but I guess essentially we thought a lot about what was going to be interesting to the audience and what was going to be dynamic and feel live. And so that meant that we ended up with a guitarist and a bass guitarist and a live drummer, that they're all really visceral, really kind of obvious live choices. whereas keyboards and samplers and stuff on a certain level is not as obvious, it's not as dynamic. So we knew we were going to sort of start with that. And then it was, in terms of what sounds we would trigger, if there's sort of 10 different layers, what's Wally going to do, what am I going to do? It just came down to what we could do with our hands before we ran out of fingers. And also just covering the hooks of the songs, I guess. You know, maybe there's a synth pad that performs a really interesting function in the mix, but who wants to see me spend a whole song just pressing a keyboard down, like a keyboard button down, when I could be playing a hook line or something that's quite obvious. The idea of obviousness came up a lot. We were really trying to make it obvious what we were doing.
What you're doing, yeah.
The first show that we played down in Melbourne, my mum came. A lot of my family came, actually. And it was great. It was the first time I'd ever played with a band, ever, with Gotye. Mum was excited. And I remember coming down to into the lobby to say, hi, and there was a bit of a hug and stuff. Mum said to me, I'll never forget, "Oh, it was great. So proud of you. I really don't know what you were doing, but it sounded great." And then I just realised we needed to do more work in terms of making it obvious. Because, Wally and I would work hard for every song and every show. But if it just looks like this, especially on the big stages we were playing, it just doesn't work. So we had to figure out ways to make it obvious.
Yeah, and obviously did a great job of it.
Yeah.
What were those ways that made it obvious? Was there any eureka moments where you're like, oh, maybe not just launching a sample by pressing one button or making it a bit of a stretch across the stage or something?
Yeah, that was part of it. I guess, just being aware of the physicality of what you're doing as well. I think for my first couple of shows, I maybe was just tentatively hitting samples, but, as we all grew in confidence as performers, you just find ways to, have some physical element of your performance. And also, using drum pads as opposed to little pads means you can grab a stick and just bash things. Part of Wally's setup was 2 big drum pads, 2 bright orange 80s looking drum pads that we set up high. And it was not because it was easy for him to play, it was because it was more dynamic, just more theatrical, I guess. Without, our show wasn't a cabaret show, but it was we wanted that element of performance, of theatricality. So that's why you put them up there and you don't just make it 2 buttons on the launch pad, because there's no difference. The same sound's going to come out, but this is so much more dynamic. If you think of Eyes Wide Open, the big fence notes, boom, boom. I mean, if he's doing that up here and you could see him physically really getting into it like a taiko drummer or something. Whereas if it's this, boom, boom, these earth-shattering kind of fence notes, boom, boom, it just doesn't... Why even do that? Just put it on the track. So, yeah.
And you've talked a lot about the Gotye stuff, and obviously it's quite a big thing, but it's also now almost in the past. What are you doing yourself? What's next for you?
It's a good question. I guess the touring wrapped up in January. We did a 2-week tour through Asia. And then that's basically the end of the Making Mirrors tour, and we might all get back together and do it again depending on what the next record sounds like, if Wally makes another record. What am I doing? I've just set up a home studio at home, just sort of getting my bearings, because I actually spent most of last year overseas. I think I was overseas for about 9.5 months out of the 12. So I've just, on a personal level, been reconnecting with all my friends and my wife and daughter. But yeah, I've been building a studio at home, and now I'm doing a lot of songwriting and composing and lots of different projects, but unfortunately none of it's probably going to come out for a while, because essentially starting from scratch, and these things can take time in terms of getting songs finished and getting people together. So,
is there any particular sort of creative vision or inspiration that you're any compass point that you're heading towards?
Multiple points in different directions, unfortunately, for better or worse. I've always been the kind of guy that wants to do 10 things at once, so I'm doing 10 things at once. So I've got a few different sort of proto bands, I guess you could call them, just collaborations with different songwriters that might eventually turn into different discrete projects. I'm working on a soundtrack for an iOS game, which is the first time I've done that, that's really fun, a whole different set of challenges. And I also perform a live show I did back a couple of years ago, which is very visually intense. It's sort of an interactive, immersive audio-visual show that I performed under the name Time Shield, and I'm sort of bringing that back as well. It's big sheets and YouTube clips and weird wangers. So basically, I'm doing a lot of stuff, right?
Cool. No,
cool.
Yeah, done. Yeah, answered. Well, thank you very, very, very much. That was amazing, really enlightening.
Excellent.
Everyone, give it up.